In the winter of 1873, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whispered about 11-year-old Emma Richter in hushed, fearful tones. This pale, quiet child could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history within seconds, memorize entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once, and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. What modern science might recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was, to the people of 1873, either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. But when Emma began using her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed, the community's amazement turned to terror. By spring, 3 men would be dead, a family would flee in the night, and Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. What the residents of Brewery Town didn't realize was that Emma's gift would expose a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that had been carefully hidden for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873 was a bustling enclave of red brick breweries, modest wooden homes, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air. The community of nearly 8,000 German immigrants had built their own little Bavaria along the shores of Lake Michigan, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil. The men worked in the breweries, Schlitz, Best, and dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous, while their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland. Heinrich and Greta Richter had arrived from Bavaria in 1861 with dreams of prosperity and their infant daughter, Emma. Heinrich found steady work as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population. Greta took in laundry and mending to supplement their income, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Galena Street. The Richters were unremarkable in every way except for their daughter. Emma had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature and so small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey. But survive she did, though she remained slight and pale, with enormous gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. As a toddler, she rarely cried or demanded attention, content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. By age 4, Emma's parents began to notice something unusual. She could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers. She counted everything: the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps from their front door to the bakery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. When Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, she absorbed mathematical concepts with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. The German community initially viewed Emma's abilities with a mixture of pride and unease. Old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossed herself whenever Emma's calculating gray eyes fixed on her. But Father Kohler, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, declared Emma's gifts to be a blessing from God, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. The winter of 1872 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping so low that Lake Michigan froze solid for the first time in a generation. The brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors, while their wives struggled to keep their families warm and fed through the long, bitter months. It was during this isolated winter that Emma's abilities began to take on a darker character, though no one yet understood what was coming. Emma had developed the habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to notice patterns, not just in numbers, but in human behavior. Mr. Kruger always walked to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when he took a different path that required 284 steps. Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry in a specific sequence, but when her husband worked late at the mill, she changed the order completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a gray February morning in 1873. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, when she suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2. The story continues in the same cleaned, slightly polished style all the way to the end. The final mention of Emma Richter in any historical record comes from a brief notation in the New Ulm College Mathematics Department records from 1875. Professor Hermann Weiss reported that his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, but that her family had decided to relocate once again for personal reasons. After that entry, Emma Richter disappeared from history as completely as she had vanished from Milwaukee on that dark night in May of 1873. What happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision remains unknown. Some researchers have theorized that families possessing children with unusual abilities deliberately maintain their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution. Emma's story represents one of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications. This mystery shows us that the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1873, Emma Richter's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. In 1873, Emma Richter's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. Poorhouses and orphanages provided children in exchange for payments. She had also cultivated contacts among criminal elements in major cities who could identify vulnerable children, runaways, street orphans, and others who wouldn't be missed immediately. Perhaps most chillingly, the records showed that the Sullivan operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children being held had increased, and there were plans in the correspondence for establishing similar facilities in other locations. The discovery at the Sullivan farm had apparently interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming a much larger operation. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete exposure of the Sullivan network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was a girl named Rebecca, approximately 14 years old, who had been held longer than any of the others. Unlike the other children who had been broken by their ordeal, Rebecca had maintained a spark of defiance and an extraordinary memory for details. Rebecca had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania when she was just 9 years old. She remembered everything about her capture, how a woman claiming to be a distant relative had arrived at their farm, how she had been lured away with promises of sweets and a ride to town, how she had awakened chained in the Sullivan basement. More importantly, she remembered every conversation she had overheard between Constance Sullivan and the various visitors who had come to the farm over the years. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation was just part of a much larger network. She had heard Constance discussing other farms, other locations where children were being held. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between different facilities. Her information provided law enforcement with their first comprehensive picture of the scope of the criminal enterprise.
The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described a visit that had occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man had arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 other men. Rebecca had been selected, along with 3 other children, to be inspected by the visitors. The man had examined them carefully, checking their teeth, their muscle tone, and their general health like a buyer evaluating livestock. The visitor had ultimately decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too damaged for his purposes. However, he had left behind a letter containing detailed specifications for the type of children he wanted to purchase. The letter, which was found among Constance Sullivan's papers, described requirements for children of specific ages, physical characteristics, and temperaments. The language was cold and businesslike, discussing human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The letter was signed H. Blackwood and included a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities investigated, they discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been purchasing children for years, ostensibly as household servants, but actually for purposes that the investigation would reveal to be even more sinister than the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection opened up an entirely new dimension of the case. Southern plantation owners, it appeared, had been using the child trafficking network to acquire workers who would be completely under their control. Unlike enslaved people who had some legal protections and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death with no legal consequences. They had no families to search for them, no legal status to protect them, and no hope of escape. The investigation of the Blackwood connection revealed that several other prominent Southern families had been involved in similar purchases. The children were being used not just as laborers, but as subjects for medical experiments, as targets for violent entertainment, and for purposes that the investigators found too disturbing to document fully in their official reports. As the scope of the criminal network became clear, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families involved in purchasing children had significant political connections and substantial resources to protect themselves. Threats began to be made against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home from work. Dr. Whitfield found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by several prominent patients. The pressure was clearly designed to intimidate law enforcement and prevent the full extent of the network from being exposed.
The situation became even more dangerous when one of the surviving children, a boy named Timothy, who had been providing crucial testimony, disappeared from the temporary shelter where he was being housed. A search was conducted, but Timothy was never found. The message was clear: those who cooperated with the investigation would face severe consequences. Despite the intimidation, the investigation continued. Federal marshals provided additional security for key witnesses and investigators. The surviving children were moved to more secure locations, and armed guards were posted at the Sullivan farm to protect the physical evidence. The case had become a test of whether the American legal system could function when confronted with crimes involving wealthy and powerful perpetrators. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan herself was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious. Sullivan had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the criminal network, including the names of all her contacts and customers. Her death eliminated the investigation's most important witness and source of information about the broader conspiracy. The mysterious death of Constance Sullivan sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved in the case was safe. The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise so vast and so well connected that it posed a threat to some of the most prominent families in American society. Just when it seemed that the investigation might be derailed by intimidation and violence, an unexpected development changed everything. A former employee of Henry Blackwood, motivated by guilt over what he had witnessed, came forward with evidence that would blow the case wide open. The employee, a man named Samuel Pierce, had worked as an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and had detailed knowledge of the children who had been purchased from the Sullivan network. Pierce brought with him documents that proved the connection between the Sullivan operation and the Southern buyers. More importantly, he had witnessed the fate of many of the children who had been sold to plantation owners. His testimony would provide the final pieces of the puzzle and expose the full horror of what had been happening to America's most vulnerable children.
Samuel Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond would go down as one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. Pierce, a man in his 40s with weathered hands and haunted eyes, had worked for Henry Blackwood for over a decade. What he had seen on the Blackwood plantation and what he revealed about the fate of the Sullivan children shocked even the seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the scope of the criminal enterprise. Pierce described how the Blackwood plantation operated two separate systems. The main plantation used enslaved labor for cotton production, operating under the typical, though brutal, economic model of Southern agriculture. However, Blackwood had also established what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where the trafficked children were held for purposes that had nothing to do with agricultural production. The children purchased from the Sullivan network were used as subjects for medical experiments that Blackwood conducted with several associates, including 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College. The experiments were designed to test the limits of human endurance, to study the effects of various drugs and treatments, and to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children as laboratory animals rather than human beings. Pierce's most damning testimony concerned the detailed records that Blackwood maintained of these experiments. The plantation owner had documented everything: the children's reactions to different treatments, their survival rates under various conditions, and the progression of diseases that were deliberately introduced to study their effects. The records showed that Blackwood and his associates had been conducting systematic torture disguised as medical research. The testimony revealed that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood over the years. Of these, only 4 had survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers. The rest had died as a result of the experiments, malnutrition, or the brutal working conditions in the experimental quarters. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the plantation. Pierce also provided information about the broader network of buyers. He had been present at meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and even some politicians. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the entire country, with different buyers having different requirements and purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Pierce described a gathering he had witnessed in the fall of 1833. Blackwood had hosted what he called a demonstration for potential buyers from across the South. The event was designed to showcase the quality of the children available through the network and to demonstrate the various uses to which they could be put. Pierce's description of this gathering was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury had to leave the room. The demonstration had included displays of the children's ability to perform various types of work, their responses to different forms of punishment and control, and their suitability for different types of exploitation. The buyers had been encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, businesslike atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scope of the network. The prices paid for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children, who could be more easily controlled and conditioned, commanded higher prices. Children with specific physical characteristics or abilities were sold at premium rates. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune for the time period. The investigation team used Pierce's information to coordinate raids on multiple locations across the South. Federal marshals, working with local law enforcement, simultaneously struck at plantations, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 100 additional children were rescued from various locations. Physical evidence was seized that documented the full extent of the trafficking network, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases and sales.
Samuel Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond would go down as one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. Pierce, a man in his 40s with weathered hands and haunted eyes, had worked for Henry Blackwood for over a decade. What he had seen on the Blackwood plantation and what he revealed about the fate of the Sullivan children shocked even the seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the scope of the criminal enterprise. Pierce described how the Blackwood plantation operated 2 separate systems. The main plantation used enslaved labor for cotton production, operating under the typical, though brutal, economic model of Southern agriculture. However, Blackwood had also established what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where the trafficked children were held for purposes that had nothing to do with agricultural production. The children purchased from the Sullivan Network were used as subjects for medical experiments that Blackwood conducted with several associates, including 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College. The experiments were designed to test the limits of human endurance, to study the effects of various drugs and treatments, and to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children as laboratory animals rather than human beings. Pierce's most damning testimony concerned the detailed records that Blackwood maintained of these experiments. The plantation owner had documented everything: the children's reactions to different treatments, their survival rates under various conditions, and the progression of diseases that were deliberately introduced to study their effects.
The records showed that Blackwood and his associates had been conducting systematic torture disguised as medical research. The testimony revealed that at least 37 children from the Sullivan Network had been sold to Blackwood over the years. Of these, only 4 had survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers. The rest had died as a result of the experiments, malnutrition, or the brutal working conditions in the experimental quarters. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the plantation. Pierce also provided information about the broader network of buyers. He had been present at meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and even some politicians. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the entire country, with different buyers having different requirements and purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Pierce described a gathering he had witnessed in the fall of 1833. Blackwood had hosted what he called a demonstration for potential buyers from across the South. The event was designed to showcase the quality of the children available through the network and to demonstrate the various uses to which they could be put. Pierce's description of this gathering was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury had to leave the room. The demonstration had included displays of the children's ability to perform various types of work, their responses to different forms of punishment and control, and their suitability for different types of exploitation. The buyers had been encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, businesslike atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scope of the network. The prices paid for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children who could be more easily controlled and conditioned commanded higher prices. Children with specific physical characteristics or abilities were sold at premium rates. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune for the time period. The investigation team used Pierce's information to coordinate raids on multiple locations across the South. Federal marshals working with local law enforcement simultaneously struck at plantations, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 100 additional children were rescued from various locations. Physical evidence was seized that documented the full extent of the trafficking network, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases and sales.
Several prominent individuals were arrested, including Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, and a state legislator from Georgia who had been one of the network's best customers. The evidence seized during the raids painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked the nation. The trafficking network had been operating for over 30 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized hundreds of children. The level of organization and sophistication was unprecedented for any criminal enterprise of the time period. The medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his associates were documented in horrifying detail. The records showed that the experimenters had deliberately infected children with diseases to study their progression, had tested various poisons and toxins, and had conducted surgical procedures without anesthesia or proper medical training. The children had been treated as disposable research subjects, their lives valued only for the scientific knowledge that could be extracted from their suffering. The investigation also revealed the corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments had been bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or to approve adoptions that were actually sales. Even some law enforcement officials had been involved in covering up evidence and intimidating witnesses.
The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that had occurred across multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of many of the defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the trafficking network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Sullivan case became a catalyst for the first federal legislation addressing child trafficking and abuse. It led to reforms in the oversight of orphanages and poorhouses, and to the establishment of new legal protections for vulnerable children. The final resolution of the Sullivan case would take nearly 5 years to complete, but its impact on American society was immediate and profound. The public reaction to the revelations was one of horrified fascination mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many publications dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The surviving children faced a long and difficult path to recovery. Most had been held for years and had no memory of life before their captivity. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement required extensive medical treatment, psychological care, and patient work to help them readjust to normal human interaction. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose testimony had been crucial to exposing the broader network, became something of a celebrity as news of her courage spread. However, the attention proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania who provided the quiet, supportive environment she needed to heal. Rebecca lived to be 73 years old, eventually marrying and raising her own family, but she never spoke publicly about her experiences after the trial testimony. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking network. Ezra Sullivan, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836, before a crowd of over 3,000 people. His last words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. Henry Blackwood's trial became a sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of Southern plantation society. The medical records seized from his plantation provided evidence of systematic torture and murder that shocked even hardened observers. Blackwood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years by appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1841, reportedly of a heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets. The 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College who had participated in the experiments were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their cases led to new regulations governing medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself faced a scandal that nearly resulted in its closure, as investigators revealed that several other faculty members had knowledge of the illegal experiments but had failed to report them. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that didn't reflect the severity of their crimes. A state legislator from Georgia, who had been one of the network's major customers, was censured by his legislature but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the trafficking network had generated enormous profits for its organizers. Constance Sullivan alone had accumulated over $12,000 in profits over her 20-year operation, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Sullivan farm itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in a place associated with such evil. The house was demolished in 1845, and the basement was filled with concrete and sealed permanently. A small cemetery was established at the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. The case led to significant reforms in child welfare and protection. Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems.
The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Sullivan case had demonstrated the limitations of state-by-state law enforcement when dealing with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New federal statutes gave marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing precedents that would prove crucial in later criminal justice developments. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the need for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for orphaned children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase, "another Sullivan case," entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Sullivan operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the rest of his career to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children and became an advocate for reforms in medical practice that would prevent physicians from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were influenced heavily by his experience with the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for decades. Crawford's detailed reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for law enforcement officers across the country. The children's stories, as they emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to build relatively normal lives with proper support and care. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and other problems that stemmed from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered at all, dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Sullivan basement contained references to other operations, other victims, and other perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Sullivan operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other parts of the country. The children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history, and that the legal and social systems had been inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Millbrook, who had lived for 20 years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious?
These questions led to broader discussions about the obligation of communities to watch out for their most vulnerable members. The Sullivan case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled abuse, and of assuming that respectable appearances guaranteed moral behavior. The legacy of the Sullivan case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, financial records, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations, using it to understand how systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities. In the end, the Sullivan family's reign of terror was brought to an end not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore obvious signs of trouble. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Rebecca's determination to testify despite her trauma, these individual acts of moral courage were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The basement where 47 children were found chained has been sealed for over a century. But the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse.